By 1794, France had gone completely insane. What started as a revolution for liberty had become a machine of death. The promises of freedom and equality had drowned in blood. The streets ran red with it. The air reeked of it. A man named Maximilien Robespierre controlled the Committee of Public Safety, and he saw enemies everywhere. In every shadow, every whisper, every face that didn't show enough revolutionary passion. Aristocrats hiding in attics, priests celebrating secret masses, anyone who didn't applaud loud enough at public executions. The solution was simple. Kill them all. Let God sort them out. Except Robespierre didn't believe in God. In less than a year, the Revolutionary Tribunal sent over 17,000 people to the guillotine. In Paris, executions happened daily, sometimes 30 people in a single afternoon. The executioners developed a rhythm, mechanical, efficient, inhuman. Load, position, drop, next. They could kill a person every 2 minutes when they worked efficiently, like butchers in a slaughterhouse. The Place du Trône Renversé, where the Carmelites would die, executed over 1,300 people in just 6 weeks. The ground was so soaked with blood that pools collected in the cobblestones. The earth itself seemed to weep red. Neighbors filed formal complaints about the smell. The stench of death had become a public nuisance, an unbearable reminder that they were living in hell's antechamber. But Robespierre had a special hatred for one institution, the Catholic Church. He saw it as an ally of the monarchy, a system that kept people stupid and obedient, sheep waiting for a shepherd. So he launched a war against faith itself. Churches were closed or turned into temples of reason. Priests were forced to publicly renounce their vows or face the blade. Religious holidays were abolished. Even the calendar was changed to erase any trace of Christian influence. And wearing a religious habit, that was now a crime punishable by death. For the 16 Carmelites, living in their quiet convent in Compiegne, 50 miles from Paris, this was a death sentence waiting to be signed. They just didn't know when it would arrive. A vow made in blood. In September 1792, soldiers came and expelled them from their home. Rough men with rough hands who kicked down doors and shouted orders. Out, all of you! This building belongs to the Republic now. The nuns were forced into the streets, forbidden to wear their habits, forbidden to live together, forbidden to be what they had been their entire lives. But Mother Teresa of St. Augustine, their prioress, a woman whose quiet strength had held the community together for years, refused to let them scatter like ashes in the wind. She found 4 small apartments in town where they could live in secret, continuing their prayers in whispers, their faith driven underground but unbroken. And then she did something extraordinary. She gathered her sisters in the dim light of a hidden room and made a proposal, her voice low but fierce with conviction. Would you be willing to offer your lives as a sacrifice for France? Not to seek death, but to accept it if it comes. To offer our suffering so that this bloodshed might end. The room fell into a heavy silence. 2 of the older nuns hesitated, their faces pale with fear. The idea seemed like madness, like inviting the very destruction they had been hiding from. But Mother Teresa's eyes held something that made them pause. Not fanaticism, but a deep, aching love. I know what I'm asking, she said quietly. Pray. Pray and tell me if God asks this of you. She gave them time to wrestle with their terror, to face the darkness of what was being asked. Within hours they returned, faces streaked with tears, asking forgiveness for their fear. We are ready, Mother, one whispered, if it is His will. The community voted unanimously. From that day forward, every morning at 4 a.m., while Paris slept off its daily orgy of violence, the 16 Carmelites renewed their offering. They prayed that if their deaths could purchase peace for France, God would accept the sacrifice. They didn't know when death would come. They only knew they were ready. They had made peace with their ending. For 2 years they waited, praying, hiding, watching as the terror consumed everyone around them. Friends, neighbors, innocent people dragged to the scaffold for the crime of being suspected. Then in June 1794, someone talked. June 21st, 1794. Soldiers broke down the door before dawn, wood splintering, hinges screaming. Someone had informed on them. A neighbor hungry for the reward the government paid for exposing hidden religious, or perhaps just someone who wanted to watch them die. 2 years of careful secrecy, destroyed by one whisper. The soldiers tore through everything with savage efficiency. They found letters, prayer books, religious medals, a small statue of the Virgin, evidence that these women were still living as nuns, still clinging to their forbidden faith. One soldier held up a rosary like he'd discovered a weapon. "Fanatics," he spat, "counter-revolutionaries." The charges were fanaticism and counter-revolutionary activity. In plain language, their crime was praying. The 16 sisters were taken to a former convent, converted into a prison. The irony was cruel, almost mocking. Nuns imprisoned in a building that once protected women just like them, now twisted into a cage. But something strange happened behind those walls. Something that made even the hardened guards pause and stare. Other prisoners noticed the Carmelites. In a place filled with despair, with people weeping and losing their minds with fear, howling in the night, scratching at walls, these 16 women were different. Impossibly, incomprehensibly different. They continued their prayers. They rose at 4 a.m. as they always had. They sang hymns in their cells, voices rising through the darkness. They comforted others who were terrified, holding hands through cell bars, whispering words of hope to the hopeless. English Benedictine nuns, imprisoned in the same building, later wrote about them with a kind of awe. They seemed to be preparing for a wedding, not an execution. There was a joy in them we could not understand, a peace that made no earthly sense. On July 12th, guards came to transport them to Paris for trial. "Get up, you're going to Paris. Time to face justice." The nuns' faces showed no fear, only a strange readiness that unnerved even the revolutionaries who had seen everything. The journey took hours in open carts, exposed to the elements and the mob. Some in the crowd threw insults, rocks, garbage. "Fanatics, traitors, die, you superstitious fools." But the Carmelites didn't hide or cower. They sang hymns the entire way, their voices carrying over the noise of the mob, over the hatred, over the violence. Beautiful Latin hymns that most Parisians hadn't heard in years. By the time they reached Paris, they had already become something the revolution didn't know how to handle. Something that couldn't be explained or contained or broken by threats and violence. 16 voices say no. The trial was a joke. Everyone in that courtroom knew it. The air was thick with the pretense of justice. But underneath, everyone could smell the rot. Revolutionary trials had no presumption of innocence. No real defense attorneys, no appeals, no chance. The verdict was decided before anyone spoke a word. The tribunal existed to provide a thin veneer of legality over what was simply state-sponsored murder, bureaucracy's attempt to dress up slaughter in the language of law. The prosecutor, Antoine Fouquier-Tinville, was a man who had sent hundreds to their deaths without losing a night's sleep. He had prosecuted Marie Antoinette. He had sent scientists, poets, and generals to the blade with the same indifference he'd show swatting a fly. To him, the 16 women standing before him were just another batch of names to cross off his list. another day's work in the factory of death. He read the charges in a bored voice, like he was reading a grocery list, barely looking up from his papers. Fanaticism, hiding weapons, supporting the monarchy, corresponding with enemies of the Republic. The weapons charge would have been laughable if the stakes weren't so high. The only weapons found in their apartments were religious medals, pictures of saints, prayer books, rosaries, a small statue of the Virgin Mary. Dangerous contraband in the eyes of the revolution. But one moment stood out, one exchange that witnesses remembered for years afterward, that sent a ripple of shock through the courtroom. When Mother Teresa heard the word fanaticism, she did something defendants never did. She interrupted the proceedings, her voice clear and calm as still water. The courtroom fell into a stunned silence. Defendants didn't interrupt. Defendants stood quietly and accepted their fate like sheep before shearers. But Mother Teresa's voice held something that made even Fouquier-Tinville pause. Not defiance exactly, but a kind of fearless curiosity. "Citizen prosecutor, please explain what you mean by that word. Fanaticism. Define it for us." Fouquier-Tinville's face darkened. He looked at her like she was an insect that had dared to speak, an offense against the natural order. His voice dripped with contempt. "I mean your attachment to childish beliefs and foolish religious practices. Your refusal to embrace reason and enlightenment. Your pathetic clinging to superstition." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The spectators leaned forward. Everyone expected Mother Teresa to apologize, to beg, to collapse under the weight of his scorn. She smiled. Not a nervous smile, not a defiant smile, a peaceful smile. Radiant with an inner certainty, like someone who had just received confirmation of something they already knew. Like someone who had just been told they'd passed a test they'd been preparing for their entire lives. "If believing in God is fanaticism," she said, her voice steady and strong, "then yes, I am guilty. We all are. And we will die guilty. Gladly." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. Fouquier-Tinville's jaw clenched. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The tribunal asked each nun the same question, a final chance to save themselves. "Do you renounce your vows? Do you deny your faith? Will you swear allegiance to the Republic?" This was their last chance. The door was open. One word, one simple denial of everything they believed, and they could walk out of that courtroom alive. They could go back to their families. They could live. Constance, young and clear-eyed, answered first. Her voice rang out like a bell. "No." Sister Marie of the Incarnation, who had been a Carmelite for 30 years, whose entire adult life had been given to this faith. "No." Sister Euphrasia, who had hesitated when Mother Teresa first proposed the vow of sacrifice, who had wrestled with her fear in the darkness. Now her voice was steel. "No." One by one, 16 times, the same answer, each no landing like a hammer blow against the tribunal's certainty. No. The verdict was death, all 16. When the sentence was announced, the Carmelites didn't weep. They didn't collapse. They didn't curse the judges or beg for mercy or promise to be good if only they'd be spared. They did something that froze every person in that courtroom. They renewed their religious vows right there, in front of the men who had just condemned them. The same vows they had taken years ago in the quiet of their convent. The same vows the revolution had tried to erase from existence. And then, in voices that grew stronger with each word, they began to sing the Te Deum, a hymn of thanksgiving. They were thanking God, thanking Him for the privilege of dying for their faith. The guards stood frozen, unsure whether to stop them or how. Fouquier-Tinville's face twisted with confusion and something that might have been fear. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped his papers. "Silence them!" someone shouted, but no one moved. This wasn't supposed to happen. Prisoners didn't sing after being sentenced to death. Prisoners didn't thank anyone for anything. Prisoners broke, they wept, they begged, they cursed. They did anything but this. But no one stopped them. Perhaps even the revolutionaries sensed, in some deep and uncomfortable place, that they were witnessing something beyond their understanding. Something that made their paperwork and their tribunals and their guillotine seem very, very small. The hour Paris stopped breathing. July 17th, 1794, late afternoon. The summer heat pressed down on Paris like a suffocating blanket. The smell at the Place du Trône Renversé was unbearable. The accumulated stench of weeks of death saturating everything. The 16 Carmelites were loaded into carts with 24 other condemned prisoners. From the first moment, they were different. While others wept or sat frozen in shock, paralyzed with terror, the nuns sang. For 3 hours through the streets of Paris, their voices never stopped. The Miserere, the Salve Regina, the Te Deum, ancient hymns that Paris hadn't heard in years, echoing off buildings that had forgotten what faith sounded like. People stopped to stare, frozen in their tracks. Shopkeepers came out of their stores, wiping their hands on their aprons. Women leaned from windows, some with tears streaming down their faces. Children pointed and tugged at their parents' sleeves. "Papa, why are those ladies singing? Are they happy?" How do you explain this to a child? How do you explain that these women are singing because they're not afraid? Paris had seen thousands of prisoners carted to their deaths. They had seen every reaction terror could produce. But they had never seen anyone who looked peaceful, who looked almost joyful, as if they were going home rather than to slaughter. When the carts finally reached the square, the executioner Charles-Henri Sanson was waiting. He had killed thousands. He had seen every reaction a human being could have facing death. Fear that made people collapse. Rage that made them fight and curse. Despair that left them empty-eyed and hollow. Defiance that crumbled at the last moment. He had never seen what he was about to witness, and witnesses later said his hands shook as he prepared the blade. The nuns asked permission to sing one final hymn before the executions began. Sanson agreed, his voice hoarse. "Sing if you must." Maybe he was curious. Maybe even he felt something shift in that blood-soaked square, some change in the air that made the hair on his neck stand up. The Carmelites sang the Veni Creator Spiritus. "Come, Holy Spirit." 16 voices rising in the summer air, pure and powerful, drowning out everything else. Then they renewed their vows one final time, their voices overlapping in a sacred promise. Mother Teresa announced the order, her voice carrying across the square. Youngest to oldest. The youngest will die first. The oldest will die last. This was deliberate, carefully chosen. The older nuns would watch the younger ones go first, giving them strength with their presence until the very end. The youngest would not die alone. They would die held in the gaze of those who loved them. Constance stepped forward. Young, her whole life still before her, if she would only recant. The first thing she ever saw of the world outside those walls was this square, this scaffold, this blade. She walked to Mother Teresa and knelt before her one final time, her hands folded in prayer. "Permission to die, Mother." Mother Teresa looked down at the young woman she had guided for years, the girl who had entered the convent as a teenager with stars in her eyes, who had given up everything for a life of prayer, who was now asking permission to give up her life itself. The old woman's voice broke with love and grief. "Go, my daughter. Go to him who waits for you." Constance kissed the tiny terracotta statue of the Virgin that Mother Teresa held hidden in her palm, a final moment of tenderness in the shadow of death. She stood, turned, and walked toward the scaffold. The executioner's assistants moved to help her up the steps. She waved them away with a gentle but firm gesture. "I can walk to my own wedding," she said, and her voice made grown men step back. She didn't need help. Constance climbed alone, each step deliberate and sure. She positioned herself, looked at her sisters one last time with a smile that blazed with joy, and kept singing until the blade fell. The crowd was silent. No cheers, no insults, nothing. Just thousands of people holding their breath, unable to look away, unable to understand what they were seeing. The singing continued with 15 voices. Sister St. Louis stepped forward, knelt. "Permission to die, Mother." Mother Teresa's hand trembled as she blessed her. "Go, my child." The nun kissed the statue, climbed alone. The blade fell. 14 voices. Sister Euphrasia. "Permission to die, Mother." 13 voices, one by one. The same ritual, the same question asked with breathless anticipation rather than fear. The same blessing given through tears. The same solitary walk to the scaffold. Each nun pushing away the executioner's help, claiming their death as their own choice. Each nun singing until the blade silenced her voice, but never silenced what she had proclaimed. The crowd remained frozen. These were people who had watched executions for entertainment, who had made a sport of death, who had cheered and jeered and demanded faster killings, more blood, more spectacle. Now they stood in complete silence, some weeping openly, watching 16 women transform a killing ground into something sacred. Something they couldn't name, but could feel in their bones. 12 voices, then 10, then 8. Each execution took less than a minute. But to the crowd watching, time had stopped. The world had narrowed to this moment, this impossible act of courage. There was no jeering, no applause, no impatient shouts to hurry up. Just thousands of people standing motionless, tears streaming down faces that hadn't wept in months, while 16 women turned their deaths into something that looked like worship, like victory. Sister Julie of Jesus, a lay sister who had spent her life doing the convent's manual labor, the humble work that kept the community running, climbed the scaffold with the same dignity as the choir nuns. She had never learned Latin. She had never studied theology. But she sang the hymns from memory, the same way she had sung them every day for decades. Sister Mary of Jesus Crucified was 78 years old, the eldest, bent with age but unbowed in spirit. She had been a Carmelite for over 50 years. She'd survived wars, famines, and the collapse of the monarchy. Now she stood before the executioner who would end her life. She paused and looked at him directly, her ancient eyes meeting his, not with hatred, not with fear, with something that made Charles-Henri Sanson's breath catch in his throat. "I forgive you with all my heart," she said quietly, reaching out to touch his arm with a gentleness that broke something in him. "And I pray God forgives you too. You are only doing what they command." Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner, had heard thousands of final words. Curses that made him flinch, prayers that made him uncomfortable, screams that haunted his dreams, confessions whispered in desperation. But this tiny old woman, barely 5 feet tall, offering him forgiveness with such sincere compassion, stopped him cold. His hands shook as he stepped back. She climbed the scaffold without help, still singing with what remained of her sisters, her voice thin but clear. 5 voices, then 3, then 2, and finally only 1. Mother Teresa of St. Augustine stood alone in the square. She had watched 15 of her daughters die. 15 times she had blessed them. 15 times she had held the statue they kissed. 15 times she had said, "Go, my child," each time tearing another piece from her heart. Now there was no one left to bless her, no one to give her permission, no one to hold the statue for her to kiss. She stood in a silence so profound it seemed to swallow the world. She looked at the crowd. Thousands of faces staring back at her in silence, many wet with tears, all frozen in a kind of horrified reverence. She sang the final verse of the Salve Regina alone. Her voice carried across the square, across the blood-soaked ground, across the bodies of her sisters. Witnesses later said it was the most beautiful sound they had ever heard, and the saddest. Then she climbed the scaffold with the same grace she had shown every day of her religious life. She didn't hurry. She didn't falter. She positioned herself beneath the blade, looked up at the sky with an expression of perfect peace, and the song ended. The blade fell, and Paris went silent. Witnesses later wrote that it was the most profound silence they had ever experienced. A silence that felt like judgment, like the world itself had stopped to watch and found Paris wanting. In a city that had grown used to death, that had normalized executions as public entertainment, as daily spectacle, 16 singing nuns had done something impossible. They had made Paris ashamed. What their blood purchased, the bodies of the 16 Carmelites were thrown into a mass grave at the Picpus cemetery, along with approximately 1,300 other victims of the terror. No markers, no ceremony, no prayers, just another pile of corpses in a city that had too many to count. But something had broken that afternoon. Something the revolution couldn't repair, no matter how many speeches they gave or how many more people they killed. Witnesses couldn't stop talking about what they had seen. In taverns and markets, in whispered conversations on street corners, the story spread like wildfire. People described the 16 nuns who had walked to death singing, the peace on their faces, the joy in their eyes, the way they had embraced the blade like it was a gift, like it was the door to something beautiful. For months, Parisians had told themselves that the executions were necessary, that the victims were enemies who deserved to die, that this bloodshed was the price of liberty. But these women, what had they done except pray? What crime had they committed except loving God? The question hung in the air like smoke that wouldn't clear, poisoning every subsequent execution, making people wonder what they had become. 10 days later, on July 27th, 1794, Robespierre was arrested. His own allies turned against him. The architect of the terror, the man who had signed thousands of death warrants with a steady hand, suddenly found himself on the other side. The next day, July 28th, Maximilien Robespierre was dragged to the same scaffold where the Carmelites had sung. He did not sing. He did not pray. He did not offer forgiveness. When the blade fell, witnesses say he screamed. A long, terrible scream that echoed across the square, the sound of a man who had built an empire of death and found only terror waiting for him at the end. The reign of terror was over. Coincidence? The revolutionaries who survived said yes. Just politics. Just timing. The death of 16 nuns had nothing to do with the fall of Robespierre. It was all strategy and betrayal and the inevitable collapse of power. But the people who had stood in that square weren't so sure. Something had shifted on July 17th. Something fundamental and unstoppable. The terror had fed on fear. It had thrived on fear. It had used fear to control, to manipulate, to justify every atrocity. And suddenly 16 women had shown that fear could be defeated, that the guillotine only had power over the body, that you could take everything from someone, strip away their home, their safety, their very lives, and still not break them if their souls remained their own. The English Benedictines, who had been imprisoned with the Carmelites, survived the terror. When they were finally released, stepping back into a world that had gone mad and come back, they discovered that the nuns' civilian clothes had been left behind in the prison. They kept them as relics, sacred objects stained with the sweat and tears of martyrs. They spent the rest of their lives telling anyone who would listen about what they had witnessed, about the women who sang their way to heaven. The Catholic Church took longer to respond. For over a century, Rome said nothing official about the Carmelites. Some historians believe the Church was ashamed of its inability to protect them. Others think the story was too politically dangerous for an institution trying to make peace with France, trying to find its footing in a world that had tried to erase it. It wasn't until 1906 that Pope Pius X beatified the 16 martyrs. And only in December 2024, Pope Francis officially declared them saints. 230 years. That's how long it took for the Church to officially recognize what the crowd in Paris understood in a single afternoon. That these 16 women had shown the world what faith looks like when it refuses to bow. There's a cemetery in Paris where the Carmelites are buried. Picpus. It's hidden behind walls, away from the tourist maps. Most Parisians have never heard of it. Inside it's quiet. Trees, grass, a small chapel with names inscribed on the wall. Approximately 1,300 names, victims of the terror. Most of them forgotten, dust and memory. But 16 of those names still echo. Constance, Marie, Julie, Teresa. Women who chose death over betrayal, who answered terror with music, who showed a city drunk on blood what courage actually looked like. Every July 17th, a small group gathers at Picpus. They light candles, they pray, and they sing the same hymns that Constance and her sisters sang 230 years ago. The Salve Regina, the Veni Creator. Voices in a quiet cemetery keeping alive the memory of voices that once silenced a screaming mob. 16 women who believed their sacrifice could stop a massacre. Were they right? Did their deaths end the terror? History can't prove it. Causation is always slippery, always debatable. But we know this. 10 days after they died, the architect of the terror died on the same scaffold. And 230 years later, people still remember the names of 16 singing nuns, while the names of their executioners have faded into nothing. Maybe that's the only answer that matters. Maybe the real victory isn't surviving. It's being remembered for what you refuse to surrender. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.